What is neurodiversity?
What is it about these people?
Dyslexia,
autism spectrum,
ADHD,
Gifted,
dysgraphia.
All brains are different.
It's okay to be who you are.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 88. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and I'm the author of 2 forthcoming books, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom and Raising Twice Exceptional Children, a handbook for parents of neurodivergent gifted kids. I'm really excited to share today's conversation with you. Parents often struggle with helping their children manage anxiety, and today I'm talking with Dr. Eli Lebowitz of Yale University about his work with children and their parents on managing anxiety and OCD. Before we launch into this interview, we invite you to join our Facebook group. We actually have a bonus feature that we will share in the group where Dr. Lebowitz answered some questions directly from our group members. And so if you'd like to see that or be able to submit your own questions for future guests, please join us. The group's name is the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group. Don't forget to follow us on other social media platforms too. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram as the Neurodiversity Podcast, and on Twitter, we are at NeurodiversePod. Our guest today?
Hi, I'm Eli Lebowitz. I oversee the Anxiety Disorders program at the Yale Child Study Center, and I'm the author of Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD.
We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Dave Morris, the executive producer of this podcast. Putting together something like this is a huge endeavor, from planning and booking guests to putting together the finished product to buying equipment, even traveling to get the stories we present. It's a lot of work. As twice exceptional parents of 3 2E kids, my wife Emily and I wanted to start this podcast so we could share our experiences and help others along the way. So my request is this. If you get some benefit from our podcast, would you consider becoming a Neurodiversity Podcast patron? Just $1 or $2 a month can really add up, and not only would you be helping defray costs, you become eligible for some members-only perks. Listening to our podcast is a free experience, and it always will be. Chipping in will help us continue bringing compelling content to listeners around the world. Go to patreon.com/neurodiversity or go to neurodiversitypodcast.com and click support at the top of the page. And thanks.
Today, I'm talking with Dr. Eli Lebowitz of Yale University about his work with children and their parents on managing anxiety and OCD. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Lebowitz.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
I know in my practice, I see a lot of kids and teens who are dealing with anxiety for a variety of reasons and situations. But I also hear adults who are sometimes surprised that young people can even have anxiety. So maybe to start our conversation, if you can share just a little about what anxiety looks like in kids and teens, and how is that maybe different than how we see it in adults?
Well, not only can children have anxiety problems, but actually anxiety is the most common mental health problem in children and in adolescents and really throughout life. And so a staggering number of children are going to suffer from really serious anxiety disorders over the course of their development. Some of the adults who are surprised that children can feel anxious are just suffering from a little bit of memory lapse because they may have experienced a certain amount of anxiety themselves growing up. But it is true that in the past, we were less likely to detect or diagnose or treat anxiety in younger people, and that change is for the positive. Anxiety is really a problem that can manifest in a variety of different ways. And the core of the problem is a heightened sense of things being frightening, dangerous, stressful, or scary, or worrying in different ways. And that's going to manifest differently in different children. For some, it may be a fear about being separated from their caregivers and all the horrible things that could happen to them or to their caregivers when they're not together. For other kids, it may be a really excessive preoccupation with how other people are perceiving them, feeling scared of messing up socially, being judged negatively, looking foolish. And this sounds like a normal experience that, sure, we all get self-conscious some of the time, or at least many of us do. But when you're struggling with a real anxiety disorder, that can turn into a really crippling kind of fear that can significantly impair your function across a wide range of situations. For other children, it's going to be chronic worry, just persistent and interfering worry, which is just exhausting because your brain is just churning away at these worried thoughts. And it could be a different thought today and another thought next week or next month. Maybe you hear your folks arguing, and then you just lie in bed all night thinking about, what does this mean? Are they going to split up? Will they get divorced? Who am I going to live with if they do get divorced? Wait, am I going to have to move? Will I have to go to a different school? And you could just lie awake all night thinking like 30 steps down the line of all the negative scenarios that could possibly occur because you heard your parents having an argument. And the next week you could just be on to something else. And those are some of the most common forms of anxiety, in addition to things like the specific phobias, just really strong, irrational fears of just about anything that can really get in the way of normal function.
How are you noticing the impact of the pandemic in kids' overall anxiety? I feel like that's something that has just been unexpected, for us to all have to deal with. And obviously, have you noticed, is it with everything kind of perhaps reaching some level of resolution, or maybe kids are going back to school? Is it improving? I don't know. What are you seeing?
Well, it's actually a really interesting question because, like I said before, even in the best of times, anxiety problems are the most common mental health problems. But let's face it, this whole year and a half that we've been living through has really not been the best of times. And sometimes I think if you got together a panel of anxiety experts and gave them the mission to come up with a year that would exacerbate anxiety in kids and make it worse, maybe they would come up with something like the past year, because it has all the hallmark features of just everything that triggers anxiety. The uncertainty, the unpredictability, the disrupted routines, the isolation, the stress, the loss that so many children are experiencing. And so it really has been a massive hit to children's mental health, as it has been to adults as well. But your question actually raises an interesting point, because for some children, the initial phase of the pandemic was really the hardest, when everything that they relied on as their normal day-to-day life just suddenly went away, when their parents suddenly just did not have answers for all the tough questions that they were asking and were just as much at a loss as they were, when they were suddenly disconnected from their peers and social supports. And for some, that really was the hardest part. But what we're seeing, and I think this is actually really important for us to be aware of, is that there's many other children for whom the hardest part is actually coming now, when we ask them to go back to their routines. If you're a child with, let's say, some social anxiety, and you've spent a year socially isolating, not having to go to school, spending your class time on Zoom where you can turn off your camera and look away, and it's really hard to kind of force you to be in that situation. And now suddenly we're asking that kid to walk back into a classroom full of kids. That can feel daunting. Or if you're a child with some separation anxiety and you've spent a year not leaving the house and your parents pretty much not leaving the house either, but now suddenly they go back to school, to work, and you go back to school, that can feel overwhelming. And so there are a lot of children who are actually struggling today, even more than they may have been in the earlier parts of the pandemic. And it's going to take a long time until we figure out all of the long-term effects of living through this whole experience, but it's definitely not over.
Some of my clients, it's almost been a blessing where they've really thrived, surprisingly. Mm-hmm. And now their families are in this interesting situation where they have to make a determination, do we try to continue this a little bit? Do we try to, do something different, or do we go back to it? It's a really difficult decision for those families.
It really can be. And None of us really have a great sense of what's the right thing to do in this situation. And the guidance that we're given from the powers that be is sometimes confusing and contradictory and muddled. And we're all kind of trying to figure this out as we go along. And what we were told yesterday may be different from what we're told tomorrow. And that puts a lot of stress on parents who have to ultimately take responsibility and make these decisions. And some of that stress is trickling down to the kids as well, who are pretty good at sensing when their parents are in a state of uncertainty or confusion or stress as well.
If there's a parent who is concerned that their child is experiencing anxiety, would you encourage them to go forward and seek an official diagnosis? Like, are there reasons that a family might want to formalize that diagnosis, or are there some reasons where they might want to avoid doing so?
I think the first thing you can do is have a conversation with your kid, even before you seek that professional advice or consultation, evaluation, etc. You could start by having a conversation with your kid and have that conversation in a calm way. If you seem stressed and scared or panicked or angry or upset, then you're going to convey that to your kid as well. You could just start by asking some questions like, how are you doing? What is on your mind? Share a little bit of your experience and model to your family that it's okay to go through difficult emotional experiences. And we all do sometimes. Sometimes we're so determined to show our kids that we're there for them and that we're strong and that we're not rattled, that without realizing it, we may also be giving the message it's bad to be rattled, or it's not okay to be upset. It's like if you have to deny it and grit your teeth and stiff upper lip and we're all fine all the time, it makes it harder for your kid to tell you when they feel like something is difficult for them. So just having those conversations is probably a good place to start. But if you are concerned that your child is struggling with anxiety, yes, I think reaching out for some professional consultation makes a lot of sense, and there's very little to be lost from doing that. And you can start by having a conversation with your pediatrician, your primary care provider. In many cases, they'll be able to give some helpful advice or to refer you to somebody who can do a more thorough assessment and evaluation. Your child doesn't need to have a serious, clinically impairing, disabling mental health disorder for them to benefit from some help, for them to benefit from some strategies or some skills for coping better. And you as a parent can benefit from learning some strategies for helping your child to cope with anxiety. Anxiety is a part of life for all of us. And the more we can learn to handle it well, the better off we're going to be. So I think that in most cases, if you are concerned, reaching out for that consultation is probably only going to be a plus, and there's not a lot of downsides to that.
I hear you saying, though, also that even if those concerns don't meet the threshold for clinical diagnosis, there's still a benefit, and kids or teens might need some support in those areas.
Absolutely. That is very, very true. And the biggest obstacle to that is sometimes the financial obstacle. If you have an insurance carrier, for example, they may not feel like paying for a mental health therapy, consultation, etc. makes sense unless somebody is diagnosing your child with a mental health disorder. And that's an unfortunate facet of the way our health system, and in particular, mental health care system, is set up. But there are often ways that you will be able to get some advice or to get some help. And it's one of the reasons that compels me to write books like Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, which is really written for parents so that if you are, for one reason or another, whether that is financial or geographic or time, etc., if you're not able to get help from a mental health specialist, to see a therapist every week, you may be able to learn a lot of skills and tools that will be very impactful and that you can do on your own time at home.
Yeah, that brings me actually to my next question, which is that I think, parents want to help, but they're also often worried about how to best help their children without, crossing that line between helping too much or also not enough. Do you notice that parents, even on their own, you talked about it a little bit, but they influence their children's anxiety in one way or the other, could be more productive in how they're supporting their child?
I think absolutely, yes. I think there's a huge role for parents in supporting children who are coping with anxiety, whether that is a serious struggle with an anxiety disorder or a more day-to-day normal kind of challenge of dealing with anxiety, as every child is going to do sometime. I think there's a huge role for parents in that. But before I say more about that, I also want to say that parents are not the cause of children's anxiety disorder. And I think this is just such an important distinction to make. It's so easy to make that leap, and it's a false leap from you as a parent can help your child to overcome anxiety, to leap from that to you as a parent must be the reason that your child has anxiety in the first place. And I am keenly aware that as a mental health professional myself, I'm a psychologist, I represent the field of mental health, and it is a field that has a very rich history of blaming parents for children's mental health conditions. We have done this over and over again in so many areas: schizophrenia, autism, eating disorders, other problems. And you know what? Time and again, actual research, empirical research into these theories and hypotheses falls flat. It does not support those hypotheses. I don't know any serious researchers today who think that parents are the actual cause of schizophrenia or the actual cause of autism, but that was a common theory that was put forward by the field. And so I just want to, before we even talk more about how parents can be helpful, I just want to say as clearly as I possibly can that I don't believe parents are the cause of children's anxiety disorders in the vast majority of cases. It is possible to be such an awful parent that you will have a negative impact on your child's mental health. But I'm talking about things like abusive parenting, maltreatment, serious neglect. Of course, those things are damaging. Of course, they're harmful, and we should not do them, and we should intervene when parents are doing them. But that's not the story for the huge majority of kids who struggle with anxiety. And so with that being said, I think, yes, there is a huge role. If your child has an anxiety problem, you didn't have to give it to them. But if they have an anxiety problem, how you respond actually becomes really important. And the dilemmas that you were pointing to before are the dilemmas that parents of anxious children are encountering every day, and often many times a day. Like, do I push or do I not? Right? Do I intervene? Do I take over and help my child in this way? Or am I just giving in by doing that? Am I being manipulated? Or is this real? All of these questions that parents are going to be coping with throughout millions of little interactions over the course of day after day and year after year. And sometimes we fall into some traps when we're responding to an anxious child. For example, we might fall into the trap of being overly protective, right? If I see my job as I need to make sure that my child won't be uncomfortable or won't be in distress ever, then that's going to drive me to a high level of protective behavior. And nobody likes to see their kid in distress, right? You have to be really mean to enjoy seeing your kid in distress. But the fact of the matter is that when you take that protective stance, the message you're giving to your child is a really problematic one, because what they're learning is, I can't handle discomfort. I can't handle anxiety. I can't handle distress. And that's a really kind of weakening message for a child to internalize. And actually means they're going to have a lot more anxiety over the course of their life, because when they do get anxious, they're going to think, uh-oh, I can't handle this. It's like if your child had a physical illness, say they were just newly diagnosed with something like, I don't know, diabetes, something like that. Well, I don't think you'd sit that child down and say, what a shame that you have diabetes because you can't handle it. You suck at diabetes. And this is, you're just the wrong kid to have it and you can't take it. That would be a really terrible message to give because they have to handle it. You want them to feel like they can. And so you say something that's more like, you know what, it does suck that you have diabetes. That's a challenge, but you're going to be fine. You can handle this. And so that protective message can be unhelpful. But another trap that parents fall into is the more demanding side. And that's when you're so focused on making sure that your child is coping that you can't accept the fact that it's hard for them. And you start expecting them to behave as though they don't have anxiety, but they do. And you want them to either not feel the way they feel or act like they don't feel the way they feel. Sometimes that comes out in kind of mild ways, like when your kid says, "Oh, it's scary." And you say, "No, it's not." And it's like, you don't really mean to say, you're lying to me. But your message is, yeah, what you're feeling is just wrong, right? Or I don't even believe that you feel it. Sometimes we do it in even harsher ways. Like when we say, "Oh, you're being a baby. You're being a sissy. Your baby sibling can do this. I think you should be able to too." Yeah, maybe, but maybe my little sibling doesn't have an anxiety disorder. And I do. That makes a real difference. And so I realize this is a long answer. But what I suggest and what we have found to be the best alternative to either that too protective side or that too demanding side is what I call a supportive stance. To be supportive of your child when they feel anxious, when they're showing you distress. And being supportive really means putting together two ingredients. It's a really simple recipe, just two ingredients, but you do need both to make it, right? It's like mac and cheese. You can't make it without both the mac and the cheese. So you don't need a lot of ingredients, but you do need both of them. And the two ingredients of support are acceptance and confidence. What I mean by acceptance is showing your child that you get it, that you understand that this is how they genuinely feel. It can be really simple. It can be like saying to your child, "I get it. This is hard for you." And confidence means showing your child that you believe they can handle it. Yes, it is hard, and I know that you can handle it. When you put those two messages together, that's when you're being supportive. And that means that you're not being too protective and you're not being too demanding. And we find this is the best way to try to navigate those tricky situations by just sticking to that message of support, the acceptance and the confidence. And you're unlikely to go wrong with that.
What are some practical steps that parents could put into place to implement that balance of acceptance and confidence?
So the first thing is really just practicing saying those things. It's actually not that complicated, but it sometimes is not intuitive. Sometimes we think, yeah, my kid knows that I accept it. I don't need to say that. Well, maybe they know, but maybe they don't. And sometimes there's a benefit to just actually explicitly saying it. So I would say before you do anything else, just practice making those supportive statements. Write them down for yourself. Put them on your phone, and just like remind yourself, I'm going to be supportive. I'm going to practice saying, I get it. I see that you're really upset right now. I see that this is hard for you. I see that you're scared, and I know that you can handle it. I believe you're going to be okay. I think you are strong enough to get through this. Words like that. Now, the other thing that I think is really important on the really practical side is figuring out what are the things that I'm doing in my actual behavior that may be actually maintaining my child's anxiety rather than making it better. It's ironic, but sometimes the things that we do because we want to help our child to be less anxious actually end up maintaining the anxiety over time. For example, maybe my child does have social anxiety, and lots of parents are going to be familiar with this situation. Somebody unfamiliar walks up and they want to be nice, and so they address my child. They ask them a question. What's your name? How are you doing? How do you like the whatever, the movie? But my child is socially anxious and they're uncomfortable. And so they look away and they don't answer. And I see that they're uncomfortable. So what do I do as a parent? I jump in. I answer for them. I say, oh, yeah, he loves this movie. Or this is little Sophia. Or I'm stepping in, and they're relieved in that moment. They're less anxious now because, great, mom is here to help or dad is here to help. But the next time they're in a social situation, they're going to be just as anxious, and it ends up maintaining it. Or maybe my child has separation anxiety, and I know that they're scared when I'm not around. So we make it a point never to go out together as a couple and leave my kid, with a babysitter, because we know that triggers their anxiety, and I don't want to trigger their anxiety. Why would I? And so we make that sacrifice. Or maybe they're scared at night when they have to be in their bed. And so they come and they sleep in my bed next to me, or I go and I sleep in their bed next to them so that they won't be scared. Maybe they're just worried, like in generalized anxiety, and they keep coming to me with their worried questions. Are you going to get divorced? I heard you arguing. Are you going to get divorced? Or I heard on the news that maybe cell phones cause cancer. Are you going to get cancer because you use a cell phone, don't you? I know you do. Everybody I know does. Are we all going to die? And I keep answering those questions, right? And so it's like, no, don't worry. No, that's not right. No, here, let's go look online. No, it's going to be fine. No, I promise. And by keeping on doing that, it feels like I'm helping them to be less anxious because in that moment, they're relieved. But what we know from a lot of research into this area is that those behaviors that I'm doing, which we call accommodations of the anxiety, when I'm accommodating the anxiety in this way, meaning I'm changing my behavior to help you to be less anxious, those accommodations actually end up maintaining anxiety over time. And so you could be pouring tons of time and energy, resources, sometimes even money into trying to accommodate this kid, but they're just staying anxious, maybe getting more anxious. And so another thing that I recommend parents do is think over, what are the things that I'm doing that are accommodating? And you don't have to stop them all at once, right? I think that would be really hard and maybe a little bit overwhelming for your child as well. But you could pick one thing. And you could show your child that you believe that they can handle it. So when they come to you with that worried question, you say, I get it. You're really worried right now. That's a scary thought. You know what? I believe you can handle that. And I don't think it's helpful when I keep answering. So I'm not going to answer it. And I believe you're going to be fine. And sure, your child will be less relieved from that answer. But if you stick to that, you can help them to overcome the worry so that they, in a week or in 2 weeks or a month, maybe they're not having those thoughts anymore. And it feels hard in the moment, but they could actually overcome the problem. These two ingredients that I'm describing, these two elements, being more supportive and less accommodating, are the two main components of an entirely parent-based treatment for child anxiety that is proving to be a very effective way of treating anxiety. It's called SPACE, or Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And SPACE is really all about those two things, about being more supportive and less accommodating. And it turns out that if you do this treatment as a parent, even if your child never meets with the therapist at all, you can overcome even serious anxiety or related disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. And it's just as effective as having your child meet a therapist directly for a child-based therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, for example.
Yeah. One of the things I really hear you saying that I kind of want to emphasize is that you're not talking about pulling those accommodations cold turkey.
Right.
It's a very gradual process, and it sounds like, would you say that the parents are involving the kids in that process in some ways? Like, how does that dynamic work?
Sure. Well, first of all, we would never do this by surprise to a child. Anyone who has an anxious child probably knows that child anxiety and surprises actually don't mix all that well together. Most anxious children do not relish surprises, even positive surprises, right? Like, we planned you a surprise birthday party. No, not the best way to make an anxious child thrilled. And for some kids, sure, it's gonna, they're gonna love it. But in general, not the best cocktail. We never do this by surprise. And so you're going to be letting your child know what you're planning at every step of the way. There's no secrets involved. And if they are willing, if they're collaborative, you can actually plan some of this together with them. So for example, we might say, okay, I'm really determined to start answering fewer of these questions that I know are on your mind so many times during the day. But let's think of a plan together. Should I answer 5 questions a day this week? How would that be? And maybe your child says, no, let's make it 8 questions a day. And I would say to the parent, great, you should go for that. You should say, fine, let's do that. Let's let your child have that sense of control, some ownership of this. They're going to be happier with it. The only caution, though, that I would give to parents in that regard is remember that the plan should be about your accommodation, not about them. So the trick is not to make your child promise not to ask the questions. I recommend not extracting that promise from your child because there's lots of kids who will make that promise when they're calm, but then they're going to be really anxious and it's all going to fly out the window and they're going to come and they are going to ask you the questions, maybe not 8 times, maybe 30 times. And then you're going to be mad at them because they're not keeping their word. And it's silly. Being mad at a child for being anxious or asking those questions, it just doesn't make sense. It's not a misbehavior. It's an anxiety symptom. Would you get angry at your child because their heart's racing when they're upset? Would you yell at them like you promised you'd keep your heartbeat down? That's absurd. And it's equally absurd to get mad at your child for asking you a worried question. And so don't make it about what they're going to do. Make it about what you're going to do. But they can have some input into the plan. If your child is really not on board at all, if they're saying, no, absolutely not, no way, I need you to answer me every single time because otherwise I'm going to freak out and it's going to be horrible and my head's going to explode and I'm going to die. If they're saying that, then you can say, okay, well, this is going to be my plan and this is what I'm going to do. And you don't need to get them to agree because you're not asking them to do anything, right? This is why it's so wonderful to make plans that are just about your own behavior because you don't need to insist, you don't need to threaten, you don't need to bribe, you don't need to do any of that. There's no argument. You just do what you planned. And sure, your kid may actually get upset with you, right? When they come and they have the question and you're not answering, they may get mad at you, but there's no need for you to get mad in response. You can just be empathetic. You can say, wow, I see. It's really super hard. And it's much better to be sympathetic to your child who's upset in that moment than to lash out in response or retaliate or raise your voice. You can be really sympathetic because sure, it is hard, but also have that confidence. And you know what? The first time is going to be really hard. The second time is going to be hard. The third time is going to be a little easier. And by the next week, this is going to start feeling like the new normal. And soon you'll realize, actually, they're not even having those thoughts anymore, or they're having them so much less. So don't expect them to thank you right away. There's a lot of times in parenting where we have to make some unpopular decisions, and maybe this is going to be one of them. But I think they'll thank you later. When 6 months from now, your child has had like 3 months when they're not particularly anxious, maybe that's the time to say, remember how you used to be so upset? And every day you'd just be freaking out about all those thoughts. Isn't it amazing how you're not having that anymore? What do you think? Isn't that awesome? And maybe that's the point where they'll be able to say, yeah, I guess that was helpful to me.
Takes a little bit of reflection afterwards.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the SPACE program. I know that we have a lot of both educators and clinicians who listen to the podcast. And so I'm curious, give us a little bit more information about SPACE and how clinicians might be able to utilize it.
Yeah, so SPACE really is a therapy, right? This is a therapy in the same sense that cognitive behavioral therapy, which maybe more of your listeners may be familiar with, is a therapy, right? And SPACE is a therapy too, but it's parent-based. And so what it looks like is, instead of a therapist meeting with your child every week and listening to them and teaching them a skill or things like that, giving them some homework, etc., it looks like a therapist meeting with the parent or the parents and working with them and giving them some homework assignments to do, and mainly focused on those two things that I mentioned, meaning teaching the parent how to be supportive and teaching the parent how to recognize and reduce their accommodations. It usually takes somewhere between, I'd say, 10 and 15 sessions to do the treatment. There'll be shorter times and longer times, but that would be fairly typical. And clinical trial research from multiple studies indicates that it's a very efficacious way of treating anxiety and OCD. Therapists who want to learn more about the treatment, I would recommend, first of all, visiting the website dedicated to SPACE, which is spacetreatment.net. And there are a ton of resources for learning more about it, including books and articles and videos and podcasts like this and other resources. But there's also information on training. And like with any new therapy that you're learning, even if you are experienced in other forms of psychotherapy, if you want to be doing this work with families, I would very much recommend getting trained. And so I and others on my team have been holding training workshops for therapists who want to do this training. I admit that it's a little hard to get into the workshops because they fill up very, very quickly. And so I'm working very hard to hold them as frequently as we possibly can. But I really would recommend participating in one of those workshops. And I think in the past year, we've probably trained like 1,000 therapists.
Wow.
On doing this treatment. And for parents, I would also recommend visiting that website. And there are many resources for parents as well. And one of them that I'll particularly mention is a list of therapists who are already trained in SPACE. And so if you're a parent, you can go on that website and you can search by your country or your state, and you can hopefully find somebody nearby who can do this work with you. And if you can't, then you could try to maybe introduce a therapist who is local to where you live and maybe get them to learn more about it. I guess one benefit of the pandemic is that more people are doing teletherapy than ever before. And so it's a little bit easier in that sense to access treatment. And one thing that I'll say about SPACE is that it's a treatment that lends itself to teletherapy, because it's an adult talking to another adult or two adults. And that's a lot easier to do over Zoom or some other platform than working with a young child directly, which we're also doing over tele. And certainly there's many more people doing that than ever before, but it's a bigger challenge. Whereas SPACE really lends itself to this kind of work. So hopefully you can, go on the website, spacetreatment.net, and you can find that. You can also find a link to the book. And the book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, is really a step-by-step description of how you can do this treatment on your own, like a workbook for parents who want to implement this treatment on their own. A lot of parents are using it with their therapist, and so working through it together with a therapist. And I think that's a fantastic way to use the book. But many other parents are also using it just independently on their own. And I think that's a great way to make use of it as well. And so I think that can be a very helpful resource for a lot of families too.
Okay, so last question. If you were talking to a parent about supporting their child who is dealing with significant worry or stress or anxiety, and that parent is just feeling very overwhelmed and even helpless, what would you tell them? What advice would you give?
Well, one thing I would say to them is that in all of the field of mental health, there is no problem more treatable than child anxiety. The world is full of children who used to have an anxiety disorder. And I think this is a really important message. you may be struggling so much today. It can be incredibly exhausting, wearying, frustrating, and frankly, exasperating and even aggravating to be the parent of a child with a lot of anxiety. It's a challenge. And so if you're feeling any of those or all of those feelings, I get it. I'm the parent of 3 boys, and they're all anxious some of the time, and sometimes a little excessively anxious. I know what we're talking about. I know how frustrating and exasperating and troubling and concerning and worrying it can be for a parent. But remember that help does exist. There are so many other problems in mental health where we wish we had solutions that were half as effective as what we have for child anxiety. So give yourself a break. Don't blame yourself. Don't expect yourself to magically be able to solve the problem, but stay hopeful and get some help for yourself and for your child.
Dr. Lebowitz, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
One of the things I tell my young clients frequently about anxiety is that the number one thing their anxiety wants them to do is avoid the thing that is causing their anxiety. If they just keep avoiding that trigger, their anxiety just gets bigger and bigger, making it harder and harder to overcome in the future. As parents, it's hard to tell when it's best to back off and let our kids face their fears, and when we should intervene. Too much in either direction can be unhelpful. However, the idea of providing support and gradually reducing that support helps children feel comfortable, independent, and confident. It's more manageable than you might think, and its impact can have long-term positive benefits, both for a child's self-esteem and their self-efficacy. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Don't force me out of bed in your society. Don't push me down the road you're playing down. Don't try to fix my head, it's just your anxiety. Don't hush me now, 'cause I just wanna shout. Don't make me dance to the tune that you're humming. No, my body don't move like that. Don't make me pretend I don't see your shortcomings. You'll be running when I raise the black flag. Get out your bomb and fly away. We'll be dancing with our hands in the air when our new dawn is rising, to the break of dawn. You can't keep me in a cage made of tired ideas. It's rusting out faster by the day. I won't wear your leash, I won't take no deals. I won't stay quiet when there's so much left to say.
Thanks again to Dr. Eli Lebowitz. His research articles are linked on the episode page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. You can also find a link there to his book, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. Thanks to the Stonekeepers and Christine Smith for our closing music. And thanks to our Patreon patrons for chipping in to help. This is executive producer Dave Morris. And for Emily, thanks for listening.
We'll be dancing with our hands in the air when our new dawn is rising. We'll be dancing to the break of dawn.
This is a production of Morris Creative Services.